So my name is Kathryn Cassidy and I'm a software engineer based here in Trinity College. I work on a project called the Digital Repository of Ireland, and that's hopefully a pretty screenshot of our repository. And we're a preservation repository, so one of the things we have to make decisions about is what metadata we need in order to be able to offer long-term trusted digital preservation for our data providers. So what I'm going to pose today in the 7 minutes is the question, what metadata do we need for preservation? And then I'm going to tell you a little bit of some of the answers that we came up with, and a little bit about kind of what we did, and we can, I guess at the end, we won't be time for questions, but if people think my answers are insane or you have a different opinion, then tweet me. So. Okay, so the first thing I want to say, which probably everyone kind of knows and agrees with, but I think it bears repeating, is that preservation is not really about bits and bytes. It's not about storage. It's not a question of keeping a bit stream safe somewhere for the long term. What you're really interested in is preserving the understandability of your data and the reusability of your data. And that could be in 6 months' time. It could be for someone accessing in 6 years. It could be 60 years, 600 years. You really have to think in longer term if you're trying to provide a preservation service. So the first thing we thought we needed was a pretty straightforward one. That's rich descriptive metadata. Now, there are formats and standards available. There are lots of options there for what metadata standard you will use or how you'll create your metadata. So at the beginning of our project, we did a kind of a survey of the humanities and social sciences area in Ireland, which is our remit. And this graph is from that. We support the top four metadata standards there by popularity in Ireland. But there's a lot of stuff that's not going to fit into your metadata standard because it'll give you certain fields that you populate. But there's other information like maybe your research methodology, how you collected the data. If that was human data, maybe it was surveys and your consent forms and questions. If it was some sort of data collected by an instrument, you have information about the machine that collected the data and so on. So that information should be put in there somewhere. So we decided to allow people to upload that as kind of a separate object into our repository and link it as kind of documentation for the collection or support information for the collection. But it doesn't fit directly, it doesn't fit neatly into your descriptive metadata. The next thing obviously is rights and reuse information. So most of the metadata standards have a rights statement. Then you also need to give a license for the reuse of your data. But the other thing we thought was really interesting to do is to include the EU Intellectual Property Office's Orphan Works database file number, and we had to talk about the process for applying for that. That's kind of a new regulation that requires you to do that. And Marta, who I see up in the middle of the room there, she gave a nice talk on that yesterday, I think. Information about organisations, so funders, maybe not so much needed for preservation, but obviously funders like to get their names in there. And then the copyright holder, whoever produced the data, the contributors and so on, but also someone who you can contact in future. So if your license says you can reuse this for certain purposes, and maybe somebody wants to find out if they can get permission to use it for some other purpose, they're going to need a contact point. And again, if that's 100 years in the future and your organisation might not exist anymore, you certainly might not work there. So kind of a way to contact somebody to find out more about the data in future. Access controls, so access control lists, who's able to download it. Maybe you have embargoes, maybe it can't be published until 50 years after somebody died or something like that. Permitted uses, so that's linked to your license. Is it educational only? Is it free for any kind of use? Is it non-commercial? Who can edit it? So an access control list for the people who can download and view it, but also access control list for who can make changes to it in future. And then who can grant those permissions? You need that kind of information as well. Administrative and technical metadata, so that's things like the file format and file size and so on. A lot of that you can kind of just generate by analysing the file. Structural metadata, if you have a collection with, collection and sub-collection and kind of a structure to it, so sometimes that's captured within the metadata standard you're using. For example, if you're using something like EAD, that's kind of built into it, but if you're using Dublin Core or something, you might need to find another way to capture that information. Locations of copies, passwords, all that kind of information, so you can access the data in the future. And provenance information, so kind of other provenance information. You might want to try and capture information about the provenance before it was put into your repository, but you definitely want to capture anything, any actions, changes, preservation actions that you might have taken with the data after it was ingested into you. So if you did a format switch because maybe a format was at risk of obsolescence or something, you would need to capture information about that. And of course there are standards for keeping that metadata, that information. Okay, so the other thing we thought was like just other stuff that maybe we couldn't think of a good category to fit it into. So linked data, things like that. User-generated content, it's something that you really might find that helps with understandability of your data in the future. So if you can have annotations or crowdsourced information and so on. And then basically, yeah, anything else that's going to help with the reuse and understandability. So, having given you that huge list of stuff that we would like people to give us in their metadata, we only actually require these 6 fields in our descriptive metadata. So that's to try and get them to actually give us their data, so we don't want to make it too complicated. And then some other fields, most of which we auto-generate or inherit from collection levels, so you only have to put them in once. So what we do, instead of mandating that they give us all that stuff, we try and use education, persuasion, coercion, maybe not. So documents where we publish guidelines for how to give us good metadata, training courses, things like that. And then we have this thing that kind of helps them to, it's a life cycle, helps them to create the data and get it to us. And that's it. What is yours?